Thank you very much, Yaron, and thank you so much for allowing me to be here and to speak. I must say that Shirli and I have co-authored the paper, so she is in the paper and present. I'm reading out the text that we jointly wrote, and you will very clearly see where stuff that we are saying is referring to her part of the research, and we are both working together on a joint project. So this is very much a co-authored paper, which is why I'm allowed to claim the extra time. Scholars of the Holocaust have long recognized the importance of individual accounts to our writing of history. Despite early historians' suspicion of testimonies' unreliability, for several decades now, victims' accounts have played a prominent role in the historiographic endeavor. The question of how to integrate the victims' voices into the historical account and what distinctive insights they can offer are issues with which our subject has long grappled. And of course, thousands of witness testimonies have been amassed in the form of oral history interviews, memoirs, and others. A related but distinct source are personal archives, more and more of which are being unearthed and which are raising new questions. It is perhaps no surprise that as ever more victims near the end of their lives, they or their families approach with renewed interest those inevitable accumulated artifacts of a life, the letters and photographs, documents and legal papers and mementos stored in shoeboxes in the attic or drawers in the study or large wooden trunks in the garage. Some of these troves are modest in size, others preserve detailed records spanning continents and epochs. As Holocaust scholars, we know that ordinary people's stories, by definition subjective and idiosyncratic, can help to deepen our understanding of some of history's most challenging questions. What we'd like to do in this talk is dig a little bit further into what precisely private archives such as these can add to our understanding and writing of Holocaust history. We'll discuss through the lens of two large collections with which we've both been working. For Shirli's part, it's the correspondence of Rudolf Schwab, a subject of her related book project. And for my part, it's the collection of Dorrit Sim, about which I'll talk more in a moment. We will address several interrelated questions. How might such resources differ from the many testimonies, diaries, and other personal sources with which we already work? Are they simply another addition to this vast archive? To what extent might they offer distinctive perspectives? And what can their particular form contribute to the scholarship we produce and the wider debates in which we engage? These are big questions, and this is a short paper, so I briefly outline a few key themes, and you can see this on the roadmap for the paper. So first of all, I talk about the archiving of collections, then I talk about a number of interrelated values that we are seeing for letter collections as sources and also for memory work. The purpose of our paper is really to raise issues and to call for a wider conversation, specifically in relation to Holocaust historiography. And you will notice that those are two collections specifically by German Jews, and I'm sure other questions will arise in relation to collections from other parts of Europe. Naturally, ethical considerations are part of all our work. How we speak of private lives in public spaces, what to reveal, what not to speak about, and so on, as part of an ongoing conversation with oneself as a researcher about how we handle sensitive data. The collections we and others are working with, however, are part of much larger ethical conversations which intersect across time and space, starting with the generation of a collection and continued when it is stored, sorted, and archived, and in the considerations researchers make when they decide to write about aspects of such collections. Whether or not family members perform an ethics audit when they collect their own papers or sort through their relatives' letters, decisions are made about what to keep, what to discard or leave behind, whether to destroy or whether to leave things to happenstance, and perhaps have someone find it and take what was left. All these have an ethical dimension, particularly regarding whose voices we are able to trace. While we may not speculate about what was lost and how decisions were made, our research needs to display awareness of the processes of meaning-making constituted by the genesis of a collection itself. Let me illustrate this point with an example from the Dorrit Sim collection. The good archivist, writes Richard Cox, is as much a destroyer as a preserver. The Dorrit Sim collection is a family collection. It began its life, as far as I can tell, with Dorrit's grandfather, Julius Oppenheim, who, like many of his German Jewish and non-Jewish contemporaries, became interested in genealogy and researched a family tree. The collection also speaks of a sense of rootedness in region and culture, strongly identifying the Oppenheims with Kassel and its surroundings, narrating Julius's and his eldest son's belonging through service in World War I. Of lower middle class origin, bakers by trade, Julius appears to have been the first to attend university and train as a general practitioner with a specialization in urology. This social ascent was paired with an interest in poetry, and he chronicled his own life experiences in verse, while his wife kept a diary that detailed her children's development and demonstrated her housekeeping skills in a handwritten collection of her recipes. Until the late 1930s, this collection existed in the private spaces of the Oppenheim residence in Kassel. The decision to seek refuge in Canada by joining their youngest son Ernst shifted the collection's focus away from its certainty of place into a traumatic frenzy of preserving and discarding. What was brought to Canada had to be carefully chosen, even with a rather substantial lift of the family's household. Space was limited, and the significance of objects without an obvious use had to be justified. Joachim Schlör explores such changes in the meaning of everyday objects transferred from one cultural sphere to another through flight. The things become embodiments of conditions and circumstances, bearers of memory, of hopes. And these mediators of memory lead a life of their own. They change their nature, that is to say, they change the meanings they bear, over the years and with each new generation, and of course through the work of the researcher who finds them and tries to understand them. Indeed, the Oppenheim family also produced lists that inventoried their household, and the accompanying exchange of letters with their son Ernst in Canada demonstrates the difficult decisions about what to take and what to discard. And so we see Julius's medical instruments, all documents detailing professional qualifications, and the medals accumulated during World War I survive, testifying to their continuing, albeit changing, meaning. Similarly, the parts of the collection assembled by Ernst Oppenheim in Canada demonstrate a strong sense of curation, that is, of choosing the correspondences that he adds to the family archive. These concern the exchanges with his family, the letters seeking support for his relatives trapped in Kassel, and the post-war correspondence with Dorrit and her growing family in Scotland. Dorrit's aunt Alice, who found refuge in New York, kept her personal documents in a file entitled Restitution, a curatorial decision with drive and purpose. In Scotland, Dorrit and her children curated the archive inherited after the deaths of Ernst and Alice, with a focus on Dorrit's life in relation to the traumatic impact of the Holocaust on family history. The meaning-making practices of various collectors, hosts, and interpreters shape the materials in personal collections from their inception through to the present. By their very nature, archives are also spaces in which various professions and interests converge, creating an interdependent network of those who curate, preserve, present materials, of those who finance these activities, and of those who use the archive to conduct their own inquiries into some of the holdings. Indeed, the practical as well as the ideological reality of archival work is a crucial determining factor in the preservation of material and in the discovery of collections by and for archives and their users. The relationship between archives and their users is increasingly a research topic in its own right, not least in regard to the key role the presentation of archival resources has for historiography. Such research cuts across professional and disciplinary boundaries and provides an insight into the complexities of making sense of the past. The purpose of outlining some of these choices is to focus our attention on the historiographical contribution of these activities. A large part of the historiographical enterprise rests in the hands of those who curate collections. This includes professional or lay archivists in public, communal, and private repositories, but also by extension, families and individuals themselves. In short, we suggest considering the curatorial practices of private individuals, as much as those of archives and archivists, need to become part of historiographical discourse, and not only form the historical backdrop to our scholarly interpretive moves. It also shows the need for cross-disciplinary and cross-professional interaction, attesting to the lack of a sustained discursive space that brings together archivists and historians. Letters have generally been subject to less rigorous scholarly treatment than other forms of life writing. Various reasons have been offered for why this might be the case. Firstly, perhaps it is what one scholar calls the dross rate, or what another describes as the flotsam of individual life. Letters are written in the moment, and they are full of vivid as well as trivial details of life, as it is being lived, with usually no thought to posterity. Perhaps they are relatively understudied because of their elusiveness as sources. There are often gaps and silences in letters, things that can't be spoken about, or perhaps that don't need to be spoken about, because correspondents have shared cultural or contextual knowledge. Only we often have one side of the correspondence, or we don't know whether some letters have been lost or thrown away. And thirdly, censorship can be an issue, particularly for the period in which we are interested. Even if not officially censored, letters from the Nazi period, particularly during wartime, were often heavily self-censored. Too elusive, too ordinary, too diverse, whatever it is, write the scholars Margareta Joly and Liz Stanley, letters have neither had as serious an academic treatment nor as strong a hold on the popular imagination as other autobiographical writing. As a consequence, they are mostly used to give colour and drama to historical narratives, or to support generalizations about groups or societies that have been derived from other data. Little interest is generally shown in individuals' personal correspondence for its own sake. While Holocaust scholarship might more readily place value on such ordinary documents of life, we have yet to fully realize the potential of letters and their flotsam. The collection of Rudolf Schwab, which forms the subject of Shirli's recent research, was discovered in a trunk in a Johannesburg garage in 2009. It consists of over 2,000 letters and more than 4,000 written pages, as well as several hundred photographs and official documents. The letters span a huge range: the 5 continents across which the Schwab family was scattered. Motley relatives found their way to China, Buenos Aires, Sao Paulo, Montreal, Minnesota, France, and South Africa. And almost 4 decades between Rudolf's departure from Nazi Germany in 1933 and his death in 1971. The collection, which includes substantial correspondence with Rudolf's parents and brother left behind in Germany, with a few relatives who made it out of Germany to safety, and with his closest childhood friend, Karl Kipfer, who joined the Nazi Party and served in the Wehrmacht on the Eastern Front during Operation Barbarossa. Correspondence from Germany had reached Rudolf in Johannesburg until well into the war years. In their letters, his relatives, his father Max, mother Martha, brother Hans, grandmother, and various aunts and uncles chronicled their day-to-day lives under the Nazi regime, working, eating, socializing, going to school, even celebrating bar mitzvahs. Yesterday was the big day, and he did very well, wrote Rudolf's mother Martha in February 1936. And she goes on to say, so life goes on and the children are growing up. In addition to the family's attempts to maintain a semblance of normality, the letters related the creeping effects of Nazi rule, the immigration of beloved friends, the forced sale of Max's business, the loss of the family home, Max's sudden arrest. Much of what is contained in the letters is not necessarily is not necessarily surprising to the historian, and yet one is struck by their vivid contemporary perspective. By definition, post-war testimonies are retrospective accounts, describing the experiences of those who survived when the outcome of the events is already known. The letters, by contrast, conveyed all the uncertainties and ambiguities of life as it was lived at the time, when the future was unclear. How did the family make sense of what was happening as new laws and restrictions were passed, as international opinion ebbed and flowed, as life around them disintegrated? What did they talk about as the months and years rolled on? Of course, there are other sources that provide contemporary glimpses into the lived experiences of Nazism's victims, without the perspective of hindsight: diaries, chronicles, and songs, the subject of Shirli's previous research, and others. Among these sources, letters are distinctive as acts of exchange. They are explicitly in dialogue with one another, conversation-like, although they also lack some of the characteristics of speech exchanges. The historian of immigrant letters, David Gerber, argues that correspondence is a performance, a process through which selves are constituted. He suggests that writing, and particularly the solitary activity of writing letters to people thousands of miles on weeks of travel away, is a highly individuating activity that encourages self-analysis and throws the self back on its own psychic resources. Gerber emphasizes the link between writing and self-growth, and suggests that the act of corresponding is a fertile space within which migrants reflect on their developing identity and self-understanding, in dialogue with others. Letters, in other words, are a significant means through which individuals, particularly those separated from family and homeland by immigration or exile, make sense of their shifting realities and circumstances. They do so, moreover, in conversation with a range of others, constructing multiple selves directed at different readers. The letters that these individuals produce are not so much sources of straightforward evidence as they are, in the words of archivist Catherine Hobbs, the site of multiple constructs of a person struggling with ideas while simultaneously contradicting, convincing, and contriving. They provide not so much evidence of a singular self as the moving target of human life being enacted. We like this idea of the moving target of human life because it captures something of the messiness and elusiveness and ambiguity of what we are trying to analyze. Where we have sustained correspondences over long periods, we have even more insight into how the process of narrating lives and selves develops and changes over time. In Rudolph's case, for example, the letters reveal Martha's increasingly desperate desire to emigrate, Max's refusal to countenance leaving, and the gradual breakdown of their marriage as a result, at least in part. They reveal Rudolph's growing independence and exile, as well as his enduring connectedness to his homeland, continually refracted through the relationship with his parents. If part of the value of autobiographical forms for us as Holocaust scholars is to understand individuals' responses to particular circumstances, letters offer especially rich evidence of victims' shifting responses as they develop over time in relationship with others. One historiographical interest in these collections is in understanding them as transnational texts that construct meaning not only for individuals, but in the movement between spaces. Here, let us make us privy to meaning-making processes that different people create in the face of the same events. Letters and family collections allow us to think about many interconnected issues by focusing on their connectedness, rather than conceiving of events sequentially or as isolated issues. The advantage of plunging the historian into the messiness of everyday life is the ability to trace the existence and interlinking of life worlds. Ernst Oppenheim in Toronto encourages his brother Hans in Kassel to adopt more American ways of interacting with state officials. He should travel to Stuttgart and make his case for immigration to the United States in person, in front of the Consul General. Let us repeat this advice and admonish Hans to man up, understand the reality of the situation, and just get out of Germany. The perception of the social and political situation of German Jews and ways to address this and act differ considerably. This letter exchange allowing us fly-on-the-wall access to the unfolding events. Ernst is monitoring which doors to exit are still ajar and may allow his brother and sister-in-law to sneak through. He does not hear Hans's objections. Hans is careful, on a very limited budget, and only sees himself able to make a move when all ducks are nicely in a row, so that he may step off the steamer and into a job. Charity he is only willing to accept in the form of affidavits, and only with the understanding that he will never need to call on his guarantors. Ernst in Canada is leading an intercontinental network of communication with the aim of getting Hans and Gertrude out of Germany. His own financial situation is challenging, to say the least, following the beginning of war and the sudden end of his main business connections in Poland. It is not an overstatement to see Ernst's epistolary efforts as a form of transnational activism, linking private individuals with each other and with organizations of state and with charities, all working together for the rescue of Jews from Germany. The sources of information available to Hans point him to an approach that remains within the spectrum of how he had learned to interact with representatives of state, and betrays a continuing trust in the workings of bureaucracy. Procedures, while complicated, need to be observed, and only when done properly can the desired outcome be expected. Thus Hans relies on waiting for his immigration number to come up and will not bother the American consulate in Stuttgart unnecessarily. Ernst, on the other side of the Atlantic, has a very different impression. He pins hopes on the Evian Conference in 1938 and surmises that a quota solution will be helpful to his brother's cause. Having lived in Canada for a couple of years, Ernst has newly acquired cultural knowledge to impart to his brother, making strong suggestions about how he should interact with American civil servants, such as, don't rely on documentation and written texts, present yourself in person. There is likely to be a lack of internal organization in the consulate, therefore you are better off going in person and presenting yourself frequently, and so on. The overlapping nature of this correspondence and the increasing frustration, at least on Ernst's part, with his brother, is offering us an insight into meaning-making processes at the time. Here we observe individuals making sense of the same events in different locations, each offering an interpretation which conflicts with that of the other. Such letter exchanges also offer an opportunity to rethink our approach to chronologies of the Holocaust. Now well established, an earlier move to rethink Holocaust historiography involved the mapping of events from the perspective of victims in the face of an overwhelmingly perpetrator-led grand narrative of the Holocaust. We suggest that the letters of private individuals complicate our understanding of chronologies. While diaries and testimonies also challenge perpetrator chronologies, letters as part of wider family collections are specific kinds of sources which add a different dimension to our understanding of lives affected by the Holocaust. Schwab's and Sims' correspondences do not easily fit into what we may call the wartime chronology observed by testimonies which are specifically about a person's experiences during the Holocaust. For testimony, life before the Holocaust is largely offered as background, and diaries, particularly those who survived the murder of their authors, are mostly confined to the years of persecution, eclipsing someone like Victor Klemperer, who's got a much longer trajectory. For the collections we are working with, the chronology starts much earlier and goes on later and is shaped by the trajectories of the families and individuals' lives, for example, marriages, births, deaths, choices to move jobs, and so on, rather than the Nazis' rise to power or the war. A family collection-based approach to Holocaust historiography may thus reflect a corrective or complement to overarching narratives, which should at least complicate our historiographical perspective. While it may be challenging to snap out of treating individual perspectives as illustrative or as only very narrow proof texts for wider arguments, we can safeguard against these pitfalls by purposefully embedding changes of perspective as critical correctives within larger generalizing narratives. Rather than seeing personal collections as an opportunity to footnote the established positivist framework of Holocaust history with illustrations from below, we may instead view such archives as opportunities for an alternative historiography. Personal archives harbour the possibility of repositioning our perspective on historical events, not as micro-historical illustrations, but as new additions to the conversation about the historiography of the Holocaust. Another interpretive concern arising from family collections which expand well into the post-war period is memory work. One of the most striking aspects of these correspondences is the space they provide for memory work, for Jews to begin reconstructing stories about their lives in order to re-establish the foundations of their existence. Like the Dodson Collection, the Schwab letters mirror the dispersal of European Jewry by the Nazi catastrophe. In the years following the war, the letters of the surviving Schwab relatives crisscrossed the globe, from Europe to China, Latin America to Canada, South Africa to the United States. They are quite unexceptional in this regard. Many private archives of Jewish families from this period reveal a similar scattering across many continents. What is interesting to emerge from the letters, as mentioned earlier, is the process whereby the refugees began to reforge identities, not only in new places, but also in the fragile connections between them. As the editors of an important recent volume on migrant letters put it, conceived transnationally, the letter becomes a unique social space that exists neither in the homeland nor the land of resettlement, but in a third place that is effectively both simultaneously. Most of the Schwab relatives never saw one another in person again, but the process of corresponding took on for them, or certainly for Rudolf, the form of a virtual parallel existence, a world in which they could preserve some continuity and belonging. Letters were a means through which they maintained family ties in the most literal sense. They were the means for conveying news and keeping up to date, for discussing practicalities and legal questions, for reminiscing about old times. In these unexceptional acts, they affirmed common identities and common origins, reenacting who they had been, where they had come from, and what they had always done. Perhaps the most significant, if unlikely, point of connection for the relatives was the prolonged process of seeking restitution and reparations. For over 20 years, Rudolf fought a legal battle, first with the post-war Allied powers in occupied Germany, and subsequently with the West German state. Prosaic details of compensation claims filled the family's correspondence, debates about whether and where to claim, the value of a mahogany sideboard or a Persian rug, or Shabbat candlesticks, the frustration of dealing with obstructive bureaucrats, the reliability of this or that former acquaintance or neighbor as a witness. As they prepared a compensation claim for their grandmother, Johanna Hausmann's home in Worms, Rudolf and his cousin Rennie in Sao Paulo reminisced that it was elegant and beautifully furnished, in keeping with the family's wealth and established status in the city. In a submission to the Compensation Authority at Wiesbaden in June 1960, Rudolf included a 1933 letter from the local rabbinate confirming that his parents, and I quote, were highly respected, and that the Schwab family, which had already lived there for the past 3 centuries, had always played an important role in the community. One might expect that reparations claims would be dry documents full of tedious legalisms and not particularly relevant to historians' research. As one reads them, however, it becomes clear that they were not only legal claims, but also a medium for memory work, for the relatives to begin expressing what they had lost and to begin mourning it. What is so striking about their submissions is how far they went beyond the remit of legal claims. The process of compiling and submitting claims was a forum for them to vent their rage at Germany for what it had done and for its continued refusal to recognize their suffering. They included in their claims information that was entirely superfluous to the bureaucratic requirements and that had little power to influence the legal process. The Schwabs' history in Hanau, their esteemed standing, the irredeemable loss that their deaths had caused. The struggle for reparations was a struggle for symbolic recognition of their suffering and a means for them to confront their betrayal by their beloved homeland. It was also, paradoxically, one of the most important vehicles through which they reforged a connection with their German identities and past. In short, extended correspondences offer insight not only into individuals' discrete experiences before, during, and after the war, but also the extended and interconnected process of interpreting and understanding what had happened and making sense of reality as it was unfolding. You'll be happy to know I come to a conclusion. A little more than a decade ago, Naomi Seidman drew attention to the constructedness of Holocaust discourses and the role of translation therein. It is not an exaggeration to suggest that all we know about the Holocaust, indeed how we think of the Holocaust, relates to translation. By nature polyglot, Jewish discourse has always spanned more than one linguistic universe. Yet the Holocaust and its aftermath has brought this aspect into sharp relief. We cannot think of the Holocaust other than through translation, the events becoming visible as related only because of their translation from many different European languages into a unified discourse in European origin majority languages. This is the case particularly, but not exclusively, with sources relating to the victims of the Holocaust. Already the experience of the Holocaust involved movements across various languages, the ability to speak, or at least to understand German, being of some advantage in the negotiation of life under occupation and during the murder process. After the end of the war, communication about experiences involved translation on multiple levels, linguistic, cultural, emotional, and so on. The Holocaust in and through translation now is a growing field of inquiry which focuses specifically on testimony. What we have observed about Holocaust historiography in relation to epistolary family collections is only possible because of and heavily conditioned by translation. Already at the point of archiving, language matters for how a collection is assembled, sorted, accessed, and read, and by whom. And prior to that, the linguistic choices made by correspondents themselves offer clues about the construction of selves in unfolding transnational exchanges. Interchange and collaboration with other humanities disciplines can help historians develop a closer understanding of the linguistic particularities of letters, thus far the provenance of literary scholars and social scientists. In letters related to the Holocaust, we can see language shift, sometimes deliberately, but also subtly and over time. Some letters are written in different languages as they pass through the hands of various readers who add to the text before passing them across to their networks of family and friends. Similarly, considerations of censorship not only alter what is said, but how it is said. German speakers begin to write to each other in English, certainly from the onset of war, but also before, when families are split between different locations and surrounding correspondence is carried out in English, and English gradually replaces German as the dominant vernacular. While testimony translates the Holocaust since the end of the Second World War, we may think of letters as translating the Holocaust as events unfolded, and continue to do so much later in regard to memory work. Attention to language and close reading not only of the content but of the form of letters can expand our understanding of the transnational nature of the Holocaust and sharpen our attention to multilingual and multicultural networks of interpretation. In this paper, we've sought to demonstrate that family connections, and particularly letters, differ from other sources. Holocaust historians already work within important ways. Thereby, such collections open new areas of historiography. As dialogical sources, they offer the opportunity to reflect the construction of selves in the spaces created by transnational exchanges. In their expansion from before to well after the Holocaust, they challenge our assumptions about chronology and the place assigned to the experience of genocide within family networks. and they suggest themselves as spaces in which significant memory work is conducted. Much of the research potential that is contributed by these collections is not yet well developed. Our paper is a contribution to an unfolding discourse about personal archives and about historiography. Thank you very much. Okay, there is a lot, some of which I can answer directly, other stuff is more discursive. So first of all, thank you for having such rich questions and making all those connections. That is really helpful, and I'm really looking forward to chatting after this panel as well. Just a few kind of things that can be answered factually. I think Boaz's question about reparation and correspondence, does this have results? Yes, there are results for those reparations claims. And that is, of course, a straightforward thing that can be traced. I think we were trying to ask questions about the kind of genre of this writing that is breaching the normal, breaching the usual ways of making reparations claims, and has this wider emotional appeal where people really write as in, why haven't you answered? Why are you asking me to write this for a third time? Why am I not getting any answers? And really being very emotional in this correspondence. So we're trying to kind of rethink how we are thinking about those letters. Censorship was another big thing, that I'm sure I'm forgetting things, but censorship and self-censorship of writing. Yes, so I can only answer that with reference to the correspondence I'm working with, so that's the Dodson Collection. There is a lot of censorship. So we have one brother in Canada and a sister, first in Scotland and then in New York. They correspond very frankly with each other. In particular, they correspond with each other about the third brother, the eldest one, who is trapped in Germany and simply can't get out. There are a variety of reasons why he can't get out, not all to do with his not petitioning enough in Stuttgart. So we've got very frank correspondence, and then you can see the correspondence with the parents at home, with the brother in Germany being censored and not revealing the extent of the emotional anguish, the financial anguish, and all the planning that is going on. Similarly, the grandparents are shielded from the rather stressful stuff that is going on between brother and sister, who are really trying to help. And so there is, you can trace and see the kind of levels of where letters are self-censoring. What you get out of Germany at this time is very bland. So anything that Hans is writing, in particular after the beginning of the war, is purposefully, at least as far as I can tell, purposefully not revealing stuff. So it's very mundane, about house moves, about meeting people, about having coffee, but nothing about the emotional distress that is clearly kind of, their circle of life is getting so very small and so very confined. Yes, for the other stuff, I would right now just say thank you for all the conceptual connections, and I'd love to chat more about this, but I think I should now close this here and really hand over to the next fascinating interview.
Thank you very much.